My daughter demanded my $3 million beachfront house, looking me dead in the eye and telling me that I owed it to her. This demand came just days after I accidentally discovered I was not even invited to her own wedding. I did not argue with her. I did not scream or shout. I just nodded, smiled, and quietly called the orphanage instead. I am Victor Gallagher. I am 70 years old, a retired building contractor from Boston, Massachusetts, and somehow still healing from the wounds my own flesh and blood inflicted on me. For over 40 years, I poured concrete framed houses and built a solid life from the ground up so my family would never have to struggle. I escaped the poverty of my youth, but I could not escape the toxicity growing inside my own home. Before I continue with this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to stand up to a family member who underestimated your worth and took your love for granted. It really helps this old man know he is not alone. It was a quiet Sunday morning in early October. The kind of crisp, clear Boston morning that usually makes you appreciate being alive. I was sitting at my kitchen table drinking my usual black coffee, enjoying the silence of the house. It had been 4 years since my beautiful wife, Diane, passed away. While the walls sometimes felt a little too wide and empty for just one person, I had found a peaceful rhythm to my solitude. I was not a man who needed much anymore. I had my health, my pension, and the fruits of a lifetime of hard, honest labor. I thought I had a decent relationship with my 32-year-old daughter, Morgan. We were not incredibly close since she married her partner, Trent, a slick 35-year-old guy who always seemed to be chasing the next big payout, but we spoke occasionally, or so I completely believed. I opened up my tablet to catch up on the morning news and maybe see what my extended family was up to. I clicked on a social media profile belonging to a distant cousin of mine, someone I had not spoken to in a couple of years. She had just posted a massive new photo album. The title read, "A Beautiful Day for a Beautiful Couple." I clicked on it, taking a slow sip of my coffee, fully expecting to see a birthday party or a casual family reunion. Instead, the breath was knocked completely out of my lungs. I stared at the high-definition photographs, illuminating my screen. There, standing under a massive archway of white flowers, was my daughter. Morgan was wearing a custom flowing bridal gown, looking radiant, laughing, as she held hands with Trent, who was dressed in a sharp, tailored tuxedo. They were getting married, my only child. The little girl I used to carry on my shoulders across dusty construction sites. The daughter whose college tuition I paid for in full. She was getting married, and I was sitting in my kitchen in sweatpants, completely oblivious to the fact that her wedding day was happening without me. I did not drop my coffee mug. I did not scream out loud. But my chest tightened so painfully, I genuinely thought I was having a heart attack. I felt a cold, heavy stone drop into the pit of my stomach. I swiped through the pictures, my hands shaking violently. There were photos of the bridesmaids in matching silk dresses, photos of a massive multi-tiered wedding cake, photos of Morgan dancing with her new father-in-law. Every single image was a physical blow to my gut. I looked at the date on the post. It was from yesterday, Saturday. While I was spending my Saturday afternoon pruning the rose bushes in my backyard, my daughter was walking down the aisle surrounded by hundreds of people. People who were not me. I leaned closer to the screen, wiping my eyes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And as the initial wave of blinding shock began to settle, the seasoned contractor in me took over. When you spend 40 years bidding on commercial projects and estimating material costs, your brain is permanently wired to calculate. I looked closely at the floral arrangements in the background of the photos. Those were not cheap local flowers. Those were imported white orchids and massive clusters of rare hydrangeas. The archway alone, cascading with heavy blooms, had to cost at least $10,000 in labor and materials. The centerpieces on the tables in the background easily pushed the floral budget past $30,000. I looked at the venue itself. It was not a casual backyard gathering or a small community chapel. It was the grand ballroom of an elite country club just outside of Boston. The kind of exclusive place that requires a $50,000 deposit just to secure a date on the calendar. This was not a spontaneous elopement. This was not a quiet last-minute trip to the courthouse. This was a massive, meticulously planned, wildly expensive extravaganza. A wedding of this scale takes 6 to 8 months of coordinating booking and paying vendors. For over half a year, my daughter had been planning this lavish event, picking out dresses, tasting expensive cakes, sending out hundreds of beautiful invitations, and she deliberately, intentionally chose to exclude me. She erased me from her life without a single word of warning. Why? Did we have a massive falling out? No. We had not argued at all. Just 2 weeks ago, she had called me to ask for advice on a plumbing issue at her rented townhouse. We had spoken completely normally. She even asked how my joints were feeling with the changing autumn weather. How could a person speak to their father so casually, knowing they were about to freeze him out of the most important day of their life? I sat at that kitchen table for over an hour, the coffee turning ice cold in my mug. The silence of the house was absolutely deafening. I felt a profound, crushing sense of failure. Had I been a bad father? Had my long hours at the construction sites when she was younger pushed her away? But Diane and I had given her absolutely everything she ever asked for. My train of thought was abruptly shattered by the sharp ringing of my cell phone on the granite counter. I looked down at the caller ID. It was Morgan. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. Had she suddenly realized her massive mistake? Was she calling to apologize, crying, saying she was sorry for keeping this huge secret from me? I took a deep breath, steadying my shaking hands, and answered the phone. "Hello," I said, keeping my voice as flat and neutral as humanly possible. "Hey, Dad." Morgan's voice chirped through the speaker. It was bright, cheerful, completely normal. There was not a single trace of guilt or hesitation in her tone. "How is your Sunday going?" I closed my eyes, feeling a sudden wave of deep nausea at her sheer audacity. "It is fine, Morgan. Just having my coffee. How are you?" "Oh, I am just exhausted," she laughed lightly. "It has been a really busy weekend." "Listen, Dad, I know it is short notice, but Trent and I really need to come over and see you on Tuesday. We need to discuss something urgent." I stared at the tablet screen at the picture of her in her $30,000 floral wonderland, while she casually complained about having a busy weekend. "Urgent?" I asked softly. "Is everything okay?" "Everything is wonderful," she replied quickly. "Better than wonderful. We just have some really exciting plans for the future, and we need your help to make them happen. It is a big family discussion. Will you be home around 2 in the afternoon?" In that exact moment, a strange, cold clarity washed over me. The grief and the shock retreated immediately, replaced by a razor-sharp instinct. I was a man who had survived in the brutal cutthroat world of commercial construction. I knew exactly when I was being played. I did not confront her. I did not scream about the photos. I did not ask why I was not at the wedding. "Of course, Morgan," I said smoothly. "I will be here. Come by at 2. "Thanks, Dad. You are the best. See you Tuesday." She hung up. I put the phone down next to the tablet. She had not invited me to her wedding, but she was coming over on Tuesday because she needed something from me. The game had just begun. I am Victor Gallagher, 70 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my own daughter inflicted. As a retired building contractor, I built a solid life but could not escape the toxicity inside my own home. Last Sunday, I accidentally discovered she had a massive wedding without inviting me. 3 days later, she leaned forward across my kitchen counter, smirking. "You owe me this, Dad," she demanded, sliding a deed for my $3 million beachfront house toward me. I simply sipped my coffee and smiled. That night, I called my lawyer and quietly transferred the estate to an orphanage instead. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Tuesday arrived with a heavy downpour that washed the autumn leaves across my driveway. I spent the morning sitting in my study staring at the blueprints of old commercial complexes I had built decades ago. I needed the familiar comfort of solid lines, load-bearing walls, and mathematical certainty. Humans especially, the ones who share your blood, are infinitely more unpredictable than concrete and steel. At exactly 2 in the afternoon, a sleek black luxury SUV pulled into my driveway. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. I watched from the window as my daughter Morgan stepped out, holding a designer umbrella. She was followed by Trent. He was wearing a fitted cashmere coat, looking every bit the successful young professional he desperately tried to project to the world. They walked up the pathway with a casual, confident stride. There was no hesitation in Morgan's step. I opened the door before they could ring the bell. Morgan smiled brightly, shaking her wet umbrella on the porch. She leaned in and gave me a quick, performative hug, the kind you give an acquaintance at a corporate mixer. Her perfume was expensive, heavy, and suffocating. Trent stood behind her, offering a firm handshake and a rehearsed, gleaming smile. He called me Victor, as he always did, never sir, never dad. I ushered them into the kitchen, the heart of the house Diane and I had built. I offered them coffee. Trent declined, tapping his expensive watch, saying they were on a tight schedule. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and sat across from them. I waited. I wanted to see if there was a shred of remorse for excluding her own father from her wedding just 3 days prior. But she simply smiled, asking about my garden and making empty small talk about the Boston traffic. It was breathtaking. The absolute lack of shame was a structural defect in her character that I had somehow completely missed during her childhood. "All right, Morgan," I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "You mentioned on Sunday that you had something urgent to discuss. You said you had exciting plans and needed my help." Morgan sat up straighter, her eyes lighting up with a practiced enthusiasm. "Yes, Dad. Trent and I have been doing a lot of thinking about our future. We are ready to take the next big step. We want to build a solid foundation, start really investing in our lives, and eventually start a family." Trent nodded solemnly, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. "Exactly, Victor. We are looking at long-term wealth building. We want to make sure we are secure before we bring children into the world." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "That sounds very responsible," I replied, my voice betraying absolutely none of the storm raging inside my chest. "How can I help with that?" "Help." Morgan reached into her oversized designer leather tote bag. She pulled out a thick, crisp manila envelope and placed it on the counter. She pushed it smoothly across the polished granite until it stopped right in front of my coffee mug. She gestured for me to open it, her perfectly manicured nails tapping the paper. I set my mug down, wiped my hands on a napkin, and unclasped the envelope. At the very top, printed in bold, undeniable letters, were the words, "Property Transfer Deed." I scanned the property description. It was the address of my beachfront house in Martha's Vineyard, the house Diane and I had purchased 25 years ago. Its current market value was easily hovering right around $3 million. I stared at the legal jargon, reading the clauses that would completely sign over my full ownership rights and equity of the property directly into the names of Morgan and Trent. I slowly looked up from the papers. The silence in the kitchen was heavy, broken only by the sound of the rain against the window pane. I looked at my daughter, the little girl I had worked 80-hour weeks for. I waited for a punchline. I waited for her to say it was a mistake, but she was just looking at me with an expectant, eager smile. "Morgan." I started, my voice tight and careful. "This is a property transfer deed for the Vineyard House. You want me to sign over a $3 million estate to you." She did not flinch. She did not look away. She actually leaned forward, resting her elbows on the counter, looking me dead directly in the eye. "Yes, Dad. We need it. Trent is making some massive career moves, and we need a significant asset to leverage." I felt the blood rushing in my ears. "You want me to hand over a $3 million house?" Just like that. Out of nowhere. That is when she delivered the line. the line that permanently severed whatever fragile thread of paternal hope I had left holding onto. Her smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard sense of sheer entitlement. "You owe me this, Dad," she said, her voice dropping into a demanding, serious tone. "You did not contribute a dime to my wedding. You know how expensive it is to get married these days. Trent and I had to shoulder the entire burden of starting our lives together. So this is the most logical wedding gift. It is the least you can do to make up for not paying for the wedding." I stopped breathing. The sheer, unadulterated sociopathy of her statement echoed off the kitchen walls. She was sitting in my house looking me in the eyes and demanding a $3 million asset as compensation for a wedding I was intentionally not invited to. She was punishing me financially for a situation she had entirely orchestrated. I looked at Trent. He was nodding in agreement, his face a mask of faux professionalism, as if they were presenting a perfectly reasonable business merger. They had discussed this. They had planned this. They had deliberately excluded me from the ceremony, likely to manufacture this exact grievance, creating a fake debt that I supposedly owed them. My mind raced back to the photos I had seen on Sunday. The $30,000 flowers. The $50,000 venue. They had spent a small fortune on a lavish party. They completely cut me out of the picture, and now they were using that party to absolutely extort me. I looked at the property transfer deed resting on the granite counter. My name, Victor Gallagher, was printed neatly at the top, waiting for my signature to strip away a lifetime of hard work. I felt a volcanic pressure rising in my chest, a burning need to throw them both out of my house to scream about the photographs I had seen just 48 hours ago. I wanted to demand how she could stand under a $30,000 archway of imported white orchids and pretend it was a burden. But I did not. In the construction business, you learn very quickly that reacting in anger only causes structural collapse. When you find a crack in a foundation, you do not immediately take a sledgehammer to it. You step back, you assess the damage, and you calculate exactly how to dismantle it safely. I forced my heart rate to slow down. I kept my hands flat on the table to hide any slight trembling. I looked at Morgan, keeping my expression entirely neutral, playing the role of a confused, aging father trying to keep up with a fast-paced conversation. "Morgan," I said gently, carefully choosing my words, "you are telling me that I owe you a $3 million house because I did not contribute to your wedding. But you and I both know that I was never asked to contribute. In fact, I was not even aware that a wedding had taken place until very recently. If cost was such a massive burden to you and Trent, why did you not simply come to me? Why did you not invite your own father to see you get married?" I watched her face closely. I expected to see a flash of guilt, perhaps a momentary dropping of her eyes to the floor. Instead, she let out a soft, dismissive sigh, the kind a mother gives to a toddler who does not understand a simple concept. She reached out and patted my hand patronizingly. "Dad, please do not make a big deal out of nothing," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. It was not a real wedding. It was just a micro-wedding. Super tiny, just a handful of our closest friends gathered together at the last minute. We threw it together so quickly, we barely had time to think. We knew how much your arthritis has been bothering you lately, and we simply did not want you to make the exhausting trip down there at your age. It was just a casual little gathering, completely informal. We wanted to spare you the hassle of dressing up and traveling. The lie slid out of her mouth with terrifying ease. She did not stutter. She did not blink. She sat there in my kitchen and tried to convince me that a fully catered country club event, with hundreds of guests matching silk bridesmaid dresses and a sprawling multi-tiered cake, was a casual little gathering to protect my aging joints. I felt a cold chill wash over my skin. I was looking at a stranger. The daughter I had raised, who used to cry when she accidentally stepped on a bug in the garden, was now a calculated, remorseless liar. She was gaslighting me right to my face. Before I could formulate a response to her absurd micro-wedding myth, Trent smoothly inserted himself into the conversation. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, projecting the aura of a serious, pragmatic businessman. "Victor, listen," he began, his tone dripping with unearned authority. "The wedding costs are just a small part of the bigger picture here. We are trying to be proactive about our financial future. I recently left my corporate job at the hedge fund. I am building a tech startup from the ground up. It is a revolutionary platform, completely disruptive, but it requires substantial initial capital. We have the vision, we have the talent, but traditional banks are heavily restricting their lending right now. We need collateral to secure a major business loan to get this venture off the ground." He tapped the property transfer deed with his index finger. "That is where the vineyard house comes in. It is sitting there fully paid off, holding massive equity. By transferring the deed to us, we can use it to secure the startup capital. It is an investment in our shared family future." I stared at him, keeping my breathing slow and measured. Trent was asking me to sign over a fully paid $3 million waterfront estate so he could allegedly fund a tech startup. He was asking me to risk the property I had painstakingly restored with my late wife Diane just to fuel his sudden entrepreneurial dreams. And they were presenting this incredibly massive demand, not as a monumental favor, but as a debt I inherently owed them. Trent noticed my silence and clearly misinterpreted it as hesitation, based on sentimentality rather than sheer horror. He softened his voice, deploying what he clearly thought was his ultimate emotional trump card. "Victor, we know how much you loved going to that house with Diane. But you have to look at the reality of the situation. You are living alone now. You do not need a huge, empty beachfront house that you barely visit. It is just sitting there gathering dust and racking up property taxes. We want to build a secure future so we can finally give you grandchildren. Do you not want to see Morgan settled and secure before we start a family? This is about building generational wealth. We are taking the burden of that big, empty house off your hands so we can focus on the next generation. It is the smartest move for everyone." The manipulation was so blatant, so perfectly choreographed, that I almost had to admire their preparation. They had rehearsed this. They had anticipated my potential objections and crafted a narrative designed to make me feel old, lonely, and obligated. They painted themselves as responsible future parents, bravely building a legacy, while casting me as a stubborn old man, selfishly hoarding an empty house. They were using the deeply emotional prospect of unborn grandchildren to pry the deed to my most valuable asset out of my hands. My late wife Diane had always dreamed of seeing Morgan become a mother. She had knitted baby blankets that were still packed away in cedar chests upstairs, waiting for the day we would welcome a new life into the family. Trent and Morgan knew exactly which emotional buttons to press. They were weaponizing my grief and my love against me. I looked back down at the deed, then up at their expectant faces. My heart was completely shattered, but my mind was crystal clear. If I refused them outright, they would simply regroup and find another, perhaps more aggressive way to manipulate me. I desperately needed more time. I needed to investigate Trent's sudden departure from his lucrative hedge fund job. I needed to verify the real cost of that phantom wedding. I needed to understand exactly how deep this deception went before I made a single definitive move. I looked at the property transfer deed resting on my kitchen table, then slowly lifted my gaze to meet my daughter's eager eyes. My survival instinct, honed over 4 decades on unforgiving construction sites, took complete control of my nervous system. If I let my temper flare, if I screamed about the $30,000 floral arrangements and the massive wedding reception I was not invited to, I would show my hand. I would lose the element of surprise. They would immediately know I was onto their lies, and they would pivot to a new, perhaps more vicious strategy to take my home. I needed them to believe that their carefully crafted narrative was working flawlessly. I needed them to think they had successfully manipulated the lonely aging father they believed me to be. So instead of exploding in rage, I leaned back in my chair and let my shoulders slump forward. I allowed a deep, ragged sigh to escape my lungs deliberately, making myself appear smaller and much more fragile than I actually felt. I reached up with a trembling hand and rubbed my temples, squeezing my eyes shut, as if the sheer weight of their request was too much for my elderly brain to process. I even forced a dry, rasping cough, covering my mouth with a napkin for added effect. The performance was entirely pathetic, but it was absolutely necessary. Morgan leaned closer, her eyes scanning my face for any sign of resistance. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked. Her voice held a thin veneer of concern, but I could hear the underlying impatience. "I am just tired, Morgan," I muttered softly, keeping my gaze lowered to the granite countertop. "This is a very large request. You are asking me to hand over the house your mother and I spent our best years restoring. There are legalities, tax implications, and a whole mountain of paperwork to consider. I cannot just sign over a $3 million piece of real estate on a Tuesday afternoon without speaking to my attorney. I need time to think about this. The paperwork takes time." I watched her carefully through half-closed eyes. For a brief second, irritation flashed across her features, but she quickly masked it with a brilliant, triumphant smile. She genuinely believed she had won. She thought my hesitation was merely the natural sluggishness of an old man struggling to keep up with modern financial strategies. She looked at Trent, exchanging a swift, victorious glance that made my stomach turn. "Of course," Victor Trent chimed in, adopting his smooth corporate tone once again. "We completely understand. We do not want to rush you. But please keep in mind that the startup capital window is closing rapidly. We really need to move on this equity transfer soon so we can secure the business loan. Take a few days to review the deed. We can circle back on Friday." "Take your time, Dad," Morgan added, reaching out to pat my hand one more time. "We just want what is best for the family. We are doing this for you too. Think about the grandchildren." I nodded slowly, keeping up the charade of the worn-down patriarch. "I will review it," I promised quietly. They stood up from the kitchen table, leaving the heavy manila envelope sitting right next to my coffee mug. I walked them to the front hallway, playing the role of the gracious host. Morgan gave me another hollow, perfumed hug, while Trent offered his firm, empty handshake. I watched them step out onto the porch. The autumn rain had finally stopped, leaving the driveway slick and reflective under the gray afternoon sky. I closed the heavy wooden door behind them, listening to the lock click into place. The moment the door was secured, my entire posture changed. The trembling stopped. My shoulders straightened. The tired, fading old man vanished, replaced by the sharp, calculating contractor who had built an empire from scratch. I walked briskly into my front living room, keeping the lights off so I could not be seen from the outside. I stepped up to the large bay window and carefully pulled back the edge of the sheer curtain, peering out into my driveway. I watched Morgan and Trent walk down the paved path, chatting animatedly, completely unaware that they were being observed. They looked like a couple who had just pulled off the heist of the century. But it was what they walked toward that completely shattered the remaining fragments of their ridiculous story. Parked at the very end of my driveway, gleaming with fresh raindrops, was a brand-new, pristine white luxury sports car. It was a Porsche 911 Carrera. I know my vehicles. When you spend your entire life working around heavy machinery and fleet trucks, you learn the exact value of everything on four wheels. That specific model with the custom black rims and the upgraded trim package I could clearly see from my window did not cost a penny under $120,000. I watched as Trent casually pulled a key fob from his cashmere coat pocket. The headlights of the Porsche flashed twice and the sleek doors unlocked with a sharp chirp. He opened the passenger door for Morgan, who slid into the plush leather seats with practiced elegance. Trent walked around to the driver's side, climbed in, and started the engine. The low, powerful rumble of the high-performance exhaust echoed down my quiet suburban street. They backed out of the driveway and sped off, leaving a trail of wet leaves in their wake. I stood by the window long after they had disappeared from view, the deep rumble of the engine still vibrating in my memory. My mind, always trained to balance ledgers and calculate structural loads, immediately went to work on the numbers. The math they had just presented to me was physically impossible. Morgan had just sat in my kitchen and brazenly claimed that they had hosted a cheap, informal micro-wedding because they were financially burdened. She claimed that my lack of financial contribution to this supposed tiny gathering entitled her to a $3 million coastal property. Trent had just looked me in the eye and claimed he was a struggling startup founder, desperate for my real estate equity to secure a risky business loan because traditional banks would not lend to him. Yet they just drove away in a brand new $120,000 sports car. You do not buy a six-figure luxury vehicle if you are scraping pennies together for a backyard wedding. You definitely do not qualify for financing on a high-end Porsche if you are an unemployed entrepreneur begging for a home equity line of credit. The surface story they had fed me was not just a lie. It was a poorly constructed facade covering a massive, terrifying financial sinkhole. If Trent truly needed capital for a startup, he would have sold that car. If they were truly struggling, there would be no expensive floral arrangements at a country club. I had to find out the absolute truth right away. I stepped away from the window, leaving the sheer curtain to fall back into place. The sleek white Porsche was gone, but the echo of its engine still hummed in the quiet of my living room. I walked slowly down the hallway to my home office. It was a room lined with dark oak bookshelves, filled with binders of old architectural plans, structural engineering manuals, and decades of tax returns. I sat down at my heavy mahogany desk and woke up my desktop computer. The screen glowed to life, casting a pale light across the framed photograph of Diane that sat next to my monitor. She always saw the absolute best in Morgan. If she were here, she would be completely devastated. But she was not here, and I had to protect what we had built together. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the screen. I needed hard evidence. I could not ask her friends without raising suspicion. Then a memory surfaced. Years ago, Diane and I had created a joint email account for family matters. We used it for paying utility bills and handling mundane correspondence. When Diane passed away, I kept the account active out of pure sentimentality. I rarely checked it anymore, but I remembered that Morgan had always used that specific email address as her designated junk folder. Whenever she signed up for store discounts or random mailing lists, she used that old family account to keep her personal inbox clean. When she first announced her engagement over a year ago, she mentioned registering for various bridal websites using that same old email address. It was a long shot, but it was the only immediate thread I had to pull. I typed the familiar address into the login portal. My fingers hesitated for a fraction of a second over the keyboard before entering the password. The inbox loaded. It was a chaotic mess of tens of thousands of unread emails. Retail coupons, travel agency newsletters, and endless promotional spam completely cluttered the screen. I took a deep breath and clicked on the search bar. I typed the word wedding and hit enter. The screen refreshed, filtering out the noise. Hundreds of results appeared. Most were generic marketing emails from bridal boutiques and destination honeymoon resorts. I narrowed the search parameters, adjusting the dates to cover the past 3 months. The list shrank considerably. I began scrolling through the subject lines, my eyes scanning the text with the same meticulous focus I used when reviewing a subcontractor bid. I ignored the automated newsletters and looked for direct correspondence. About halfway down the second page of results, a specific subject line caught my attention. It was from a sender named Sterling Horizon Events. The subject line read, "Urgent outstanding balance for Gallagher Harrison wedding reception." The email was dated just 2 days ago, the Friday before the wedding. My heart gave a heavy, painful thud against my ribs. I hovered the mouse cursor over the link. I knew that opening this email would permanently destroy whatever illusion of a loving family I still clung to. But the contractor in me demanded the truth. I clicked the mouse. The email was brief, professional, and dripping with polite urgency. It was addressed directly to Morgan. It stated that while the initial deposits and the secondary installment had been processed successfully, the final balance for the reception, catering, and venue logistics had encountered a payment error. The message requested immediate resolution to ensure the seamless execution of the event scheduled for the following day. Attached to the bottom of the email was a document labeled Final Invoice and Itemized Services. I double-clicked the attachment. A highly detailed multi-page document opened on my screen. At the very top left corner was the elegant embossed logo of the Sterling Horizon Country Club. It was one of the most exclusive, fiercely guarded private clubs in the entire New England area. You had to be sponsored by a member and pass a rigorous financial vetting process. It was a place where old money mingled, completely inaccessible to a supposedly struggling startup founder. I scrolled down past the venue rental fees, which alone were staggering. My eyes locked onto the guest count section. The number was printed clearly in bold black ink. 300. There were exactly 300 confirmed guests attending this reception. My daughter had looked me in the eye inside my own kitchen and told me she had hosted a super tiny micro-wedding with just a handful of closest friends. She had painted a picture of an intimate, casual gathering meant to spare me the exhaustion of travel. Instead, she had hosted an event the size of a small convention. 300 people had received invitations, selected their meal preferences, and gathered to celebrate her. 300 people knew about this wedding, and her own father was not one of them. I scrolled down further, my analytical mind automatically breaking down the itemized list of services. This was not a modest dinner. The menu selection was obscenely lavish. There was a raw seafood bar featuring imported oysters, massive jumbo shrimp, and fresh Maine lobster tails. The primary dinner service offered a choice between prime Wagyu beef tenderloin and wild-caught Chilean sea bass. There were charges for a premium top-tier open bar operating for 6 consecutive hours, pouring vintage champagnes and imported single malt scotches. I saw line items for a 12-piece live jazz band, a professional lighting and stage crew, and custom valet parking services. I continued reading through the pages, analyzing every single charge with the cold, detached precision of an auditor. I saw the costs for the custom monogrammed napkins, the towering 6-tier wedding cake decorated with edible gold leaf, and the midnight snack stations serving gourmet sliders and truffle fries. Every line item was a testament to extreme luxury and unrestrained spending. They had spared absolutely no expense. They had orchestrated a monumental cinematic celebration of their union. Finally, I reached the last page of the document. The final total was highlighted in a thick gray box at the bottom. The total cost of the reception alone, not including the $30,000 floral arrangements I had estimated from the photographs, the custom bridal gown, or the honeymoon, was exactly $154,820. I stared at that number until the digits began to blur together. $154,000. My daughter and her husband spent a small fortune on a single evening of unparalleled indulgence. They consumed premium champagne, danced to a live orchestra, and entertained 300 guests. Then a mere 72 hours later, they walked into my home, put on a pathetic display of financial desperation, and demanded the deed to my $3 million coastal property. Morgan had the absolute audacity to claim that I owed her my real estate equity because I had not contributed a dime to this extravagant affair. She actively hidden the wedding from me intentionally, ensuring I could not offer to pay for it, just so she could weaponize my supposed lack of support against me. It was a highly calculated, meticulously executed financial con. I was dealing with a predator. I leaned back in my chair. The pain of being excluded from her wedding was gone entirely, replaced by a chilling, absolute clarity. If they had the liquid cash to drop over $150,000 on a single party and another $120,000 on a luxury sports car, they were not struggling. They did not need my Martha's Vineyard house to secure a modest business loan for a fledgling startup. The story about Trent needing collateral was a complete fabrication designed to separate an old man from his most valuable asset. They wanted to liquidate the massive equity I had spent my entire life building. I realized in that moment that I was standing on the edge of a very dangerous precipice. My own flesh and blood had targeted me as an easy mark. They assumed my age made me vulnerable to emotional manipulation. But they severely miscalculated. They forgot that before I was an aging father, I was a man who built skyscrapers. I knew how to dig deep, expose rot, and demolish a condemned structure without taking collateral damage. I reached for a legal pad and a pen on my desk. I wrote down the name of the catering company and the total amount of the invoice. Then I wrote down Trent's name, drawing a thick, heavy circle around it. The phantom wedding was just the surface level of this deception. The real disease was whatever Trent was actually doing with his finances. If he was truly unemployed, then this sudden influx of massive spending was deeply unnatural. I needed to know exactly where that money was coming from and why they were so desperately trying to steal my house. The time for playing the clueless, sentimental old man was completely over. I picked up my smartphone from the corner of my mahogany desk. The heavy silence of the house pressing in around me as I scrolled through my contact list. When you spend 4 decades building commercial high-rises and luxury condominium complexes in a city like Boston, you do not just learn how to pour concrete and set steel framework. You build an extensive network of highly influential people. You get to know the city planners, the zoning board members, the corporate attorneys, and the wealthy real estate developers who fund those massive skyline projects. These men and women operate in the exact same exclusive financial circles as the hedge fund managers and investment bankers. I knew that Trent liked to brag about his position at a prestigious financial firm in the financial district. He always wore his employment status like a badge of superiority, looking down his nose at a man like me who made a living wearing a hard hat and steel-toed boots. He claimed he had left that prestigious firm voluntarily to launch a revolutionary tech startup. But people in those elite financial circles love to talk, and secrets rarely stay buried for long. I stopped scrolling when I found the name I was looking for. Gordon Mitchell. Gordon was an old-school commercial developer, a man I had partnered with on a dozen major projects over the past 20 years. He was ruthless in a boardroom, but incredibly loyal to the people who had helped him build his empire. I tapped his name and held the phone to my ear, listening to the dial tone. He answered on the 3rd ring, his deep, gravelly voice booming through the speaker. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, briefly catching up on our respective health and the changing autumn weather. I did not waste too much time on small talk. I knew Gordon respected a man who got straight to the point. I told him I was doing a little quiet background research on my son-in-law Trent. I mentioned the name of the prominent hedge fund Trent had supposedly worked for over the past 5 years. I kept my tone casual, phrasing it as a proud father trying to understand the sudden career shift of his daughter's husband. I asked Gordon if he still played golf with the senior partners at that specific investment firm, and if he had heard anything about Trent leaving to start his own independent technology venture. Gordon went completely silent for a few seconds. The sudden absence of his usual boisterous energy told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke a single word. When he finally replied, his voice had dropped an entire octave, shifting from friendly banter to absolute dead serious business caution. He told me he was going to make a few discreet phone calls to some very high-level executives he trusted implicitly. He promised to call me back within the hour and advised me not to make any financial commitments or sign any legal documents concerning my son-in-law until we spoke again. That hour of waiting felt like an absolute eternity. I paced back and forth across the hardwood floor of my office, my mind racing through every possible scenario. I reviewed the catering invoice again, staring at the massive $154,000 total. I thought about the brand-new $120,000 sports car sitting in my driveway just yesterday. The math was screaming at me. A man who voluntarily leaves a highly lucrative career to risk everything on an unproven startup does not immediately drain hundreds of thousands of dollars on lavish parties and luxury vehicles. He hoards his capital. He tightens his belt. Trent was doing the exact opposite. He was spending money like a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose, or like a man who was desperately trying to maintain the illusion of extreme wealth. My phone vibrated violently against the desk, startling me out of my thoughts. I snatched it up immediately. It was Gordon. I answered the call and put it on speakerphone, sitting heavily in my leather chair. Gordon did not bother with any introductory greetings. He launched straight into the hard, undeniable facts he had just uncovered from the senior partners at the hedge fund. The story Trent had told Morgan, the story they had both sat in my kitchen and confidently fed to me, was a complete and utter fabrication. Trent did not leave his corporate job voluntarily to bravely pursue an entrepreneurial dream. He was unceremoniously fired and escorted out of the building by corporate security exactly 4 months ago. Gordon explained the details with grim precision. The firm had initiated a massive internal audit late in the spring and uncovered a series of deeply troubling financial irregularities directly tied to Trent's management accounts. They suspected him of severe financial misconduct and corporate embezzlement. According to Gordon's sources, Trent had been quietly shifting company funds to cover massive unexplained personal deficits. The total amount missing was substantial, but the hedge fund executives had ultimately made a calculated business decision. Pressing formal criminal charges and bringing the police into the situation would force a highly publicized trial. A public scandal of that magnitude would severely damage the firm's elite reputation and cause their wealthy investors to panic and withdraw their portfolios. Instead of seeking legal justice, the senior partners chose to handle the situation internally. They quietly terminated his employment, forced him to sign a mountain of ironclad non-disclosure agreements, and permanently blacklisted him from the entire financial sector. Trent was not a rising tech star. He was a disgraced, unemployed pariah. He had absolutely zero income, no professional prospects, and a completely destroyed reputation within his industry. He was a financial ghost. Yet he was currently driving a brand-new custom-ordered luxury sports car and had just hosted a wedding reception that rivaled a royal gala. I thanked Gordon for his extreme discretion and hung up the phone. The silence in my office was entirely suffocating. I felt a cold bead of sweat roll down the back of my neck. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk, pressing my palms against my eyes. The sheer scale of the deception was entirely staggering, but it was the underlying desperation that truly terrified me. Trent was bleeding money he absolutely did not have. He was completely cut off from his corporate salary, yet he was hemorrhaging hundreds of thousands of dollars to maintain a spectacular facade of success. My daughter Morgan had sat in my kitchen, looked me perfectly in the eyes, and demanded the deed to my $3 million beachfront property. She had claimed they needed it as collateral for a legitimate business loan. But traditional regulated banks do not lend millions of dollars to unemployed men with blacklisted financial records. A bank would run a standard background check, see his lack of income, and immediately deny the application. They did not want my Martha's Vineyard house to secure a conventional business loan. They needed my house because they were in deep, catastrophic financial trouble. The horrifying reality of their visit slowly materialized in my mind. They were not just greedy and entitled. They were actively drowning. And instead of asking for a life preserver, they had actively plotted to tie a concrete block around my ankles to save themselves. They intended to take my fully paid-off real estate asset, an estate I had poured decades of my life into maintaining, and liquidate it to cover whatever massive hidden debts Trent had accumulated. If I had signed that property transfer deed, they would have immediately stripped the equity from my home, taken the cash, and left me completely destitute. I thought about the sheer callousness required to execute a plan like that against your own father. Morgan had intentionally excluded me from her wedding so she could manufacture a fake grievance. She used her own marriage ceremony as a weapon, a psychological tool to make me feel guilty and obligated to surrender my life savings. She had probably known about Trent's termination for months. She had actively participated in the lie, proudly parading around in a $30,000 floral wonderland, while secretly plotting to steal her father's home to cover the damages. The profound sense of betrayal threatened to paralyze me, but I forced the emotion down into a tight, dark box in the back of my mind. I could not afford the luxury of a broken heart right now. I was dealing with two individuals who had completely abandoned their moral compass. They viewed me not as a family member to be cherished, but as a vulnerable, aging resource to be ruthlessly exploited. They thought I was a clueless, sentimental old man who would simply fold under a bit of emotional pressure and hand over the keys to my kingdom. They had severely underestimated my intelligence, and they had completely misjudged my capacity for retaliation. I was a man who spent his life studying structural integrity, identifying weaknesses, and reinforcing foundations. I now knew the massive glaring weakness in their entire operation. Trent was an unemployed, disgraced fraud, and they were desperately trying to cover a massive financial hole. But I still did not know the exact nature of that hole. I did not know how they had managed to pay for a $150,000 catering bill and a luxury sports car with absolutely zero income. There was another layer to this deception, a darker, more dangerous secret they were desperately trying to keep hidden from the world. I stood up from my desk, my jaw set with absolute determination. I needed professional, ruthless legal assistance. I needed someone who could dig into their financial records with the precision of a surgeon. I needed to uncover every single illicit transaction, every hidden credit line, and every dirty secret they were harboring. I was going to systematically dismantle their entire operation, brick by brick, until they had absolutely nowhere left to hide. The time for playing defense was completely over. I was going to protect my legacy, and I was going to teach my daughter a lesson about consequences she would never forget. I picked up my phone the following morning and dialed Morgan's number. My voice was perfectly calibrated to sound weary, defeated, and ultimately compliant. When she answered, her tone was guarded, likely expecting me to argue about the deed or complain about the demands they had laid out on my kitchen island. Instead, I told her exactly what she desperately wanted to hear. I told her that I had spent the entire night thinking about their future, about the hypothetical grandchildren, and about the legacy of the Martha's Vineyard estate. I said I realized I was being a stubborn, sentimental old man holding on to a property I could no longer manage. I invited them to my house for a celebratory dinner on Thursday evening. I promised we would go over the final transfer paperwork together over a good bottle of wine. I could practically hear the greedy excitement radiating through the cellular connection. She enthusiastically accepted, her voice instantly reverting to the saccharine-sweet tone she reserved for moments when she was getting exactly what she wanted. I hung up the phone and began to prepare my dining room. I was setting a stage for a performance. In the construction business, a stress test is designed to push a material to its absolute breaking point to see how it fractures. I needed to perform a psychological stress test on my son-in-law. I needed to see the unmasked reality of the man who was plotting to steal my life savings. I ordered a catered meal from a high-end Italian restaurant in the city, the kind of heavy, rich food that encourages lethargy and loose tongues. I set the table with Diane's fine china and polished the crystal wine glasses until they gleamed under the dining room chandelier. I needed them to feel completely relaxed, entirely victorious, and absolutely certain that their manipulation had worked flawlessly. Thursday evening arrived with a biting chill in the air. At exactly 7 o'clock, the roar of the Porsche engine echoed up my driveway. I opened the front door to greet them. Morgan was wearing a designer silk blouse, clutching a bottle of champagne she presented as a celebratory gift. Trent stood beside her, radiating a suffocating aura of unearned triumph. He wore a tailored navy blazer, looking every bit the successful corporate titan, despite the fact that I now knew he was an unemployed, blacklisted fraud facing potential criminal exposure. I ushered them into the dining room, playing the role of the gracious, fading patriarch. I walked a little slower than usual, deliberately shuffling my feet against the hardwood floor. I let my shoulders droop, projecting an image of physical decline. Morgan immediately took the seat at the head of the table, subtly asserting her dominance over my household, while Trent sat to my right. As we began the meal, the conversation was predictably sickening. Trent dominated the discussion, speaking loudly about market trends, disruptive technology, and his visionary plans for his non-existent startup. He used complex corporate jargon, clearly attempting to confuse me and assert his intellectual superiority. Morgan nodded along, playing the role of the devoted, supportive wife. They did not ask me a single question about my week, my health, or my feelings regarding giving away the house Diane and I had cherished. They were entirely consumed by their impending financial victory. I smiled, nodded, and offered agreeable, vague responses, carefully feeding their massive egos. I poured the expensive red wine, ensuring Trent's glass was always full, lowering his inhibitions sip by sip. The atmosphere in the room was thick with their arrogance. They truly believed I was a gullible fool, completely blind to the trap they had so brazenly set for me. As we moved on to the main course, I decided it was time to execute the stress test. I needed to show them vulnerability, a moment of profound physical weakness, to see exactly how they would react when the mask of social politeness slipped. I reached out with my right hand to pick up my crystal wine glass. As my fingers wrapped around the delicate stem, I deliberately initiated a severe, uncontrollable tremor. I let my hand shake violently, causing the dark red liquid to slosh erratically against the sides of the glass. I gasped softly, feigning sudden distress, playing the part of an elderly man losing control of his basic motor functions. I allowed the glass to slip from my trembling fingers. It hit the edge of the mahogany table and tipped forward, crashing down onto the polished hardwood floor. The crystal shattered with a sharp, explosive sound, sending fragments of glass and a wide pool of dark red wine splashing across the floorboards. Morgan let out a sharp gasp, immediately pulling her legs back to avoid the spill. "Oh my God, Dad," she exclaimed, her voice laced with profound irritation rather than genuine concern. "Look at what you just did." I immediately slumped forward, grabbing my right wrist with my left hand, putting on a display of deep embarrassment and physical frailty. "I am so sorry," I muttered, my voice perfectly pitched to sound weak and deeply humiliated. "My hands, they just stop working sometimes. The arthritis is getting so much worse. I will clean it up right now. Please keep eating." I slowly pushed my chair back and lowered myself awkwardly to my knees. I grabbed my linen napkin and began to dab at the spilled wine on the floor, keeping my head bowed, acting like a broken old man attempting to hide his shame. It was a humiliating posture, kneeling on the floor at the feet of the people who were actively robbing me. But I was not looking at the broken glass. I used the angle of my bowed head to look up directly across the edge of the table, focusing my vision entirely on Trent's face. Because I was kneeling beneath his direct line of sight, Trent believed he was completely unobserved. For a fraction of a second, the polished professional mask of the caring son-in-law completely evaporated. What I saw on his face chilled me to the absolute core of my bones. He was not looking at me with pity. He was not looking at me with concern or even basic human annoyance. Trent was staring down at me with a cold, predatory smirk. His eyes were completely dead, devoid of any empathy. It was the calculated, chilling gaze of a vulture watching a dying animal struggle in the dirt, patiently waiting for it to take its final breath so he could move in and strip the carcass bare. In that terrifying, silent moment, the entire scope of the danger I was in became painfully clear. This was no longer just a story about a spoiled daughter demanding a lavish wedding gift. This was no longer just a story about a desperate, unemployed man trying to cover his massive embezzlement debts. This was about absolute survival. Trent viewed me as an obstacle that needed to be eliminated. My physical decline was not a tragedy to him. It was a highly convenient development. If my hands were shaking, if my mind was supposedly failing, it would be remarkably easy to convince a judge or a lawyer that I was no longer competent to manage my own vast estate. I recognized that look because I had seen it before on the faces of ruthless corporate developers who wanted to demolish historic neighborhoods for cheap profit. They do not care about the foundation. They only care about the rapid extraction of usable wealth. I slowly gathered the large pieces of broken crystal, my hands perfectly steady, now that I was safely out of their direct view. I stood back up using the heavy edge of the mahogany table for dramatic support, fully reinstating the desperate facade of the frail old man. I apologized profusely once again, promising to personally replace the ruined vintage rug. Morgan simply sighed and aggressively told me to just sit down and carefully finish my meal before I foolishly broke anything else. I sat back in my chair, sipping my ice water, silently nodding along to their continued relentless bragging. They arrogantly believed they had successfully witnessed my inevitable physical decline. They deeply believed the $3 million property was already securely locked in their greedy pockets. But they had absolutely no idea that kneeling on that dirty floor, staring up at that evil predatory smirk, I had officially finalized my massive counterattack. I was not going to simply refuse to sign the deed. I was going to financially annihilate them entirely. I was going to ruthlessly expose Trent's crimes, dismantle Morgan's web of lies, and protect my lifetime legacy with the ruthless calculation of a master builder. The awful dinner finally concluded, and I quietly promised to have my lawyer review the deed by Monday. They left smiling. The war had officially just truly begun. Friday morning broke with a biting frost-laced wind that stripped the remaining dead leaves from the oak trees lining my street. I woke up long before dawn, my mind already operating at maximum capacity. The charade of the frail, shaking old man was packed away the moment Trent and Morgan's taillights disappeared down my driveway the night before. I brewed a pot of strong black coffee, showered, and deliberately put on my most structured, perfectly tailored charcoal suit. Today I was not Victor Gallagher, the grieving widower, or the manageable, lonely retiree. Today, I was the master contractor stepping onto a hostile site to initiate a massive demolition. I drove into downtown Boston as the city was just beginning to wake up. My destination was a sleek, glass-fronted building in the heart of the bustling financial district, ironically located just 3 blocks away from the massive hedge fund that had recently fired my arrogant son-in-law. I parked my truck in the underground garage and took the private elevator straight up to the top floor. I was there to see Warren Pierce. Warren was not a gentle family lawyer. He did not draft simple wills or handle amicable divorces. He was a ruthless, highly connected corporate attorney who specialized in hostile takeovers, complex asset protection, and brutal financial warfare. We had crossed paths 15 years ago during a brutal zoning dispute over a commercial development. He had systematically dismantled the opposition with a cold, terrifying efficiency. I had kept him on a very expensive retainer ever since. The receptionist, a sharply dressed woman who knew me by name, immediately ushered me into his expansive corner office. Warren was already sitting at his massive glass desk, reviewing a thick stack of legal briefs. He was a man in his late 50s, with slick silver hair, sharp predatory features, and piercing eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He looked up, removed his reading glasses, and gestured for me to sit. "You are here incredibly early, Victor," Warren said, his tone perfectly professional and deeply guarded. "You sounded completely serious on the phone last night." I did not bother with the usual morning pleasantries. I opened my brown leather briefcase and pulled out the crisp property transfer deed Morgan had so generously presented to me. I slid it across the smooth glass surface of the desk. Warren picked it up, his sharp eyes scanning the complex legal jargon with practiced speed. He raised one silver eyebrow. "A complete unrestricted transfer of the Martha's Vineyard estate," he noted dryly. "No reservations, no protective life estate clause for you. Just a straight, unmitigated handover." Who actually drafted this garbage? I pulled out the second piece of evidence, the printed catering invoice from the elite Sterling Horizon Country Club, and placed it right next to the deed. Then I leaned back and outlined the entire horrifying situation. I told him about the massive secret wedding reception that cost over $150,000. I told him about the brand new custom-ordered Porsche sports car currently sitting in my driveway. Finally, I relayed the incredibly damning intelligence I had gathered from Gordon Mitchell regarding Trent's unceremonious termination and suspected massive embezzlement from the prominent hedge fund. I watched Warren process the heavy information. The disjointed pieces of the puzzle clicked together in his analytical mind, just as they had perfectly aligned in mine. He tapped his expensive silver fountain pen against the glass desk, his expression visibly darkening. They are recklessly liquidating massive amounts of cash they absolutely do not possess, Warren concluded, his voice extremely low and serious. The hedge fund fired him quietly, which means they did not seize his personal assets to quickly recover the embezzled funds. But they definitely cut off his corporate income completely. He is bleeding out, Victor. The luxury sports car and the lavish wedding are classic desperate projection tactics. He is desperately trying to maintain the public illusion of extreme solvency to avoid triggering devastating margin calls or alerting his other aggressive creditors. And your daughter is fully participating in the active fraud to blindly secure the massive capital they need to survive. They want your coastal property because it is a massive, completely unencumbered asset. They can easily take this deed, secure a high-interest bridge loan against it by the end of the month, and rapidly drain the equity to cover his massive outstanding debts. They would deliberately leave you holding an empty shell, completely and utterly bankrupt. I know, I replied, my voice hard and entirely steady. I saw the look on his face last night when I deliberately dropped a wine glass to critically test his reaction. He looked at me like a hungry vulture waiting patiently for a meal. He is actively banking on my physical and mental decline. He foolishly thinks I am an easy mark. That is why I am here, Warren. I absolutely need you to successfully initiate a complete, highly aggressive, unrestricted forensic audit on both of them. I want to meticulously know everything. I desperately want you to comprehensively trace every single credit card, every outstanding personal loan, and every deeply hidden bank account. Find out exactly how much Trent stole from that firm, and definitively find out exactly who else he owes money to. I want to precisely know the absolute depth of their impending financial grave. I basically want a perfectly clear, incredibly detailed picture of their extreme vulnerabilities. Warren suddenly stopped tapping his pen. He looked at me very carefully, slowly leaning forward with an intense expression of genuine, unvarnished caution. Victor, you truly need to completely understand what you are directly asking me to do. I have personally known you for 15 years. I vividly know how deeply much you loved Diane, and I know how passionately much you absolutely adored your only daughter. If I officially open this heavy door, I am ruthlessly going to immediately deploy a highly trained team of specialized financial investigators who will aggressively rip their entire lives apart. We will undeniably uncover horrible things that simply cannot be unseen. Once we initiate this severe level of hostile, unrelenting investigation, and once we legally use that incredibly toxic information against them, the family bridge is permanently burned. There is absolutely no safely coming back from this. You are essentially actively declaring a scorched earth, entirely merciless financial war on your very own flesh and blood. If we conclusively proceed with this, she is factually no longer your precious daughter. She immediately becomes a legal adversary. It is strictly permanent. Are you absolutely certain you are truly ready to definitively cross that line? The deafening silence in the office was exceptionally heavy. I looked directly out the massive windows at the sprawling Boston skyline, staring at the impressive buildings I had personally helped construct. Foundations built on shifting sand always eventually crumble. You can easily patch the cosmetic cracks for years, but eventually, the whole structure will dramatically collapse and mercilessly take everything down with it. Morgan had completely compromised our foundation the exact moment she coldly looked me in the eye and comfortably lied about her wedding to deliberately steal my home. I turned my gaze back to Warren, feeling an icy, fiercely unwavering resolve heavily settling deep into my tight chest. I spent my entire adult life working 70 and 80-hour weeks, I stated, my voice remaining perfectly level. I inhaled concrete dust and thoroughly ruined my knees on scaffolding so that Morgan would practically never have to face a single agonizing day of financial struggle. Diane and I willfully sacrificed our own simple comfort to purposefully build a massive mountain of absolute security for her. We happily paid for her incredibly elite education, her lavish lifestyle, and every single extravagant dream she ever confidently articulated. I would have gladly willingly given her the Martha's Vineyard house if she had simply approached me with basic honesty and fundamental respect. If she had truthfully admitted Trent was in dire trouble, I would have swiftly hired the best corporate lawyers in the city to diligently help them. But she did not do that. She actively excluded me from one of the most important days of her life to selfishly manufacture a completely fake debt. She arrogantly sat in the very kitchen I painstakingly built, demanding my life savings as direct compensation for her own deliberate, calculated cruelty. And last night, she watched me kneel on the floor in staged humiliation, and she felt absolutely nothing. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated annoyance because I was inconveniently failing to physically die fast enough. I paused, letting the cold reality of my words sink into the room. She is not my daughter anymore, Warren. The woman I raised died the moment she decided my grief and my age were tools to be exploited. I am dealing with a predator. Unleash the hounds. The war is on. Warren did not hesitate after I gave the final order. He simply nodded, his face turning into a mask of pure professional ruthlessness. I told him we needed to buy time. If Trent and Morgan realized I was actively investigating them, they would scramble to hide their remaining assets or, worse, attempt to fast-track their plan to declare me incompetent. We needed a diversion. I instructed Warren to draft a flawless, incredibly detailed property transfer deed for the Vineyard estate. It had to look completely authentic, drafted with the exact legal language required to satisfy his ravenous greed entirely. Warren smiled a cold, calculating smile. He understood the strategy immediately. He drafted a document that was a masterpiece of legal misdirection. It bore the official letterhead of his prestigious law firm. It included all the correct parcel numbers, the precise geographic coordinates of the beachfront property, and the standard transfer clauses. But it was entirely unfiled, completely empty, and fundamentally legally hollow. It was nothing more than a highly convincing piece of paper. We added a large, faint gray watermark across the center of every single page, clearly labeling it as an advanced preliminary draft, pending final binding signature. That faint watermark was the perfect psychological hook. It signaled to them. The process was actively moving forward, keeping them pacified and arrogantly confident in their imminent victory. I left the legal office and walked back to my truck, feeling a strange, dark sense of purpose. I was no longer the grieving widower or the confused old man they thought they could easily manipulate. I was the architect of their impending downfall. I drove back to my quiet suburban house, sat down at my heavy mahogany desk, and opened my email. I attached the decoy deed and hit send. I addressed the email directly to Morgan, keeping the message brief and deliberately submissive. I wrote that Warren was finalizing the last details, and that this draft was for her and Trent to review before we scheduled the official signing next week. I wanted them to feel the heavy weight of the $3 million asset dangling just inches out of their reach. Less than 10 minutes after I sent the email, my smartphone vibrated violently on the desk. The screen lit up with a rapid succession of incoming text messages. I picked it up and began to carefully read. The messages from Morgan were a cascading waterfall of artificial affection. She sent a continuous barrage of red heart emojis, crying face pictures, and digital hands clasped in prayer. "Oh my God, Dad," she wrote textually. "This is absolutely amazing. We are so incredibly grateful. You have no idea how much this means to us and to the future grandchildren. We love you so much, Dad. You are the absolute best." I stared at the glowing screen, my stomach churning with profound disgust. Reading those words felt like swallowing broken glass. Her love was an incredibly cheap, artificial transactional performance. She was celebrating her impending theft with digital confetti. She truly believed she had successfully extorted her own father, completely severing my financial security so she could fund her husband and his desperate, fraudulent lifestyle. I did not reply at all. I let the silence hang, knowing that every hour I made them wait only heightened their greedy anticipation. They were effectively neutralized, paralyzed by their own arrogance and their absolute certainty that the trap they had set had closed perfectly around my ankles. They had absolutely no idea that I was the one who now held the iron key. With Morgan and Trent entirely distracted by the decoy document, I immediately pivoted to the defensive phase of my ultimate operation. The beachfront property was only one part of my accumulated wealth. Over 40 years of pouring concrete and erecting massive steel structures, I had built a highly liquid, incredibly robust financial portfolio. I had massive investment accounts, stable mutual funds, and significant cash reserves sitting in domestic banks. If Morgan truly intended to pursue guardianship or declare me mentally unfit, those domestic assets would be completely frozen and highly vulnerable. I needed to move my liquid capital away immediately. I spent the next 3 days engaged in intense, highly secure telephone conversations with private wealth managers and international banking specialists. Warren had provided me with a direct list of the most secure, legally impenetrable offshore financial institutions available worldwide. I was not hiding dirty money like Trent had tried to do. I was legally and systematically shielding my clean, hard-earned capital from domestic predators. I initiated a series of massive wire transfers draining my accessible domestic checking and savings accounts. I moved millions into heavily guarded trusts located in jurisdictions that completely ignored any frivolous civil family lawsuits. Every time I authorized a massive transfer, I felt a distinct layer of stress peel away from my tired shoulders. I was building a financial fortress, a solid vault that my daughter could never ever penetrate. I watched the balances on my domestic screens drop to nearly zero, while my secure, untouchable international ledgers grew substantially. I left just enough money in my local accounts to cover my basic daily living expenses and my utility bills. If Morgan successfully petitioned a corrupt judge to freeze my assets, she would find absolutely nothing but a hollow, echoing cavern of useless accounts. The psychological toll of dismantling my own financial life was incredibly heavy. Every dollar I moved represented a day I had spent sweating in the blistering summer heat or freezing on a dark winter construction site. It represented the quiet vacations Diane and I had deliberately skipped, the romantic dinners we had delayed, and the silent sacrifices we had made to ensure our family would never know the bitter taste of poverty. We had slowly built a massive mountain of solid gold for our only child, and now I was desperately burying that gold so she could never steal it. But the cold clarity of the situation kept my hands absolutely steady. I thought about Trent standing in my driveway unlocking that absurdly expensive white sports car while secretly drowning in massive corporate debt. I thought about the huge catering bill for a fancy wedding I was intentionally excluded from. They had treated my lifelong labor as a bottomless checking account meant to freely fund their delusional, reckless vanity. I was not going to simply allow my legacy to be casually liquidated by a vulture now. I meticulously verified every single offshore transfer confirmation with extreme prejudice and total satisfaction. By late Wednesday afternoon, the immense financial relocation was entirely complete. My liquid assets were locked securely away behind impenetrable walls of international banking privacy. The beachfront property was still solely in my name, effectively acting as the glowing bait in the center of the dark room. Warren and his forensic investigators were actively tearing through the ruined professional history of my son-in-law, quietly gathering the heavy ammunition we needed. I sat alone in my kitchen sipping black coffee, listening to the refrigerator. The house felt incredibly empty, but it also finally felt remarkably safe and secure now. My smartphone chimed again, breaking the silence. It was another message from Morgan. "Just checking in, Dad. Trent and I are so excited for the official signing. Let us know what time works best for you." I stared at the text, marveling at the sheer, unadulterated audacity of her tone. She was pushing gently, but persistently, terrified that the enormous prize might somehow slip through her greedy fingers. She was completely oblivious to the cold reality that she was already standing directly on the trapdoor. I typed a slow, deliberate response. I told her I would be ready on Friday. I told her to bring Trent and meet me at the downtown legal office claiming we absolutely needed a professional notary to make the property transfer perfectly permanent. The reply was completely instantaneous. Perfect. We will be there. We love you so much. I locked the screen of my mobile phone and set it face down on the cold granite counter. The board was now completely set. The pieces were all effectively moved into their final strategic positions. I had successfully secured my assets, gathered the damning evidence, and lured the predators directly into a confined, highly controlled corporate environment. They actually believed they were finally going to receive the ultimate financial reward for their brilliant, flawless deception. They had absolutely no idea they were walking straight into a brutal, highly calculated ambush. I stood up and walked into the main hallway, pausing briefly to look at the framed photographs lining the walls. Pictures of Morgan as a little girl, smiling and completely innocent. I reached out and gently took her pictures down one by one, carefully placing them in a small cardboard box. The daughter I loved was gone. Only the wealthy, ruthless contractor would be waiting on Friday. Thursday morning arrived with a heavy blanket of fog rolling off the harbor, matching the cold stillness that had settled permanently into my bones. I was sitting at my kitchen island, nursing a lukewarm cup of black coffee, when my phone vibrated against the granite countertop. The caller identification displayed Warren Pierce. It was incredibly early for him to be reaching out well before the standard corporate hours of his law firm. I swiped the screen and answered, expecting a routine update on the decoy deed or a preliminary briefing on the financial audit. Instead, Warren completely bypassed his usual polished greeting. "Victor," he said, his voice entirely devoid of its customary sharp confidence. "You need to come down to my office right now. I have the preliminary results from the forensic accounting team, and it is exponentially worse than anything we discussed. Do not wait for rush hour traffic to clear. Get in your truck and drive here immediately." The sheer gravity in his tone sent a sharp, unfamiliar spike of genuine dread directly through my chest. I did not ask any questions. I simply hung up the phone, grabbed my keys, and walked out the door. The drive into the city was a blur of gray concrete and flashing brake lights. My mind raced through a dozen terrible possibilities, calculating worst-case scenarios involving massive tax fraud or dangerous federal indictments. But nothing could have prepared me for the absolute darkness I was about to walk into. I navigated the underground parking garage with practiced efficiency and took the private elevator directly to Warren's floor. The receptionist did not offer her usual polite smile. She simply nodded and instantly escorted me through the heavy glass doors into the main conference room. Warren was not sitting at the head of the table. He was standing by the massive window looking down at the bustling streets below. The massive mahogany conference table was completely covered in thick stacks of printed financial documents, bank statements, and highlighted ledger printouts. Warren turned around as the heavy door clicked shut behind me. He looked visibly exhausted, rubbing a hand across his jawline as he gestured toward the nearest leather chair. "Sit down, Victor," he instructed quietly. I took a seat, keeping my posture rigid and defensive. The forensic audit team worked straight through the night. He began walking over to the table and resting his hands on the polished wood. We dug directly into the absolute bottom of Trent's financial history. You were entirely correct that the failed startup narrative was a pathetic lie to cover a massive deficit. But he is not just dealing with angry credit card companies or standard corporate collection agencies. Trent owes exactly $1.5 million to a highly sophisticated, deeply underground offshore sports gambling syndicate. He has been systematically losing massive bets for the past 3 years. I stared at Warren, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the catastrophic stupidity. A gambling addiction. Trent was not a victim of corporate downsizing or a struggling visionary. He was a pathetic, degenerate gambler who had burned through his lucrative hedge fund salary and then actively embezzled company funds to feed his insatiable, destructive habit. And now he owed a massive fortune to the kind of dangerous individuals who do not send polite collection letters. They send men who break kneecaps and burn houses down. That is why they are so incredibly desperate for your Martha's Vineyard estate, Warren explained, tapping a manicured finger against a thick stack of papers. The syndicate has given him a hard, non-negotiable deadline to produce the cash. They intend to leverage your property to secure a hard money loan wire, the funds to the offshore accounts, to save Trent's life, and deliberately leave you holding the absolute wreckage of a massive unpayable mortgage. I felt a profound, chilling rage radiating through my veins. My daughter was actively conspiring to sacrifice my safe, peaceful retirement to save her pathetic husband from violent loan sharks. She was willing to let me lose my home to protect a criminal gambler. But Warren was not finished. He slowly pulled a separate, much thinner blue folder from the center of the table and slid it directly across the smooth wood toward me. If that was the entire scope of the disaster, Victor, I would simply advise you to cut all ties and walk away immediately, he said, his voice dropping to a heavy whisper. But this is the specific reason I called you in here so early. The investigative team did not just trace Trent's offshore debts. They also forcefully audited Morgan's private domestic accounts to determine exactly how they managed to pay for that lavish wedding and the new luxury sports car. I reached out and opened the blue folder. Inside was a series of bank transfer receipts and withdrawal confirmations from an institution I recognized instantly. It was the private wealth management bank Diane and I had used for decades. But these specific transaction documents were not linked to my primary checking accounts. They were exclusively linked to a very specific, deeply protected trust fund. It was the Protected Medical Care Trust Diane had personally established 15 years ago for my older brother's son, Tommy. Tommy was born with severe cerebral palsy and required round-the-clock, highly specialized care. When my brother passed away, Diane made it her absolute personal mission to ensure Tommy would never ever be placed in a poorly funded state facility. She deposited hundreds of thousands of dollars into that specific trust, intending it to safely mature and guarantee a lifetime of private medical care for a truly innocent, entirely defenseless disabled boy. My eyes scanned the highlighted yellow lines on the top page. 2 months ago, exactly 3 days before the country club wedding, an electronic withdrawal of $160,000 had been successfully authorized. 2 weeks later, a second massive withdrawal of $130,000 was processed. I looked up at Warren, my vision swimming with a sudden, violent wave of pure, unfiltered nausea. Morgan was a designated secondary signatory on that account. Warren explained gently, refusing to look away from my horrified expression. She was legally listed as an emergency backup in case anything ever happened to you. But the bank still required your primary authorizing signature for any major unprecedented liquidations. Morgan completely forged your signature, Victor. She submitted fraudulent, highly deceptive authorization forms claiming the funds were being transferred for Tommy's urgent medical relocation. The bank processed the wire transfers directly into her private, unlisted checking account without raising any immediate flags. I physically recoiled from the table, feeling the air completely leave my lungs. The horrific, undeniable reality crashed down on me with the force of a falling steel beam. The $150,000 catering invoice for the lavish country club reception. The $120,000 custom-ordered Porsche sitting triumphantly in my driveway. They were not purchased with maxed-out credit cards or desperate personal loans. They were purchased with stolen medical funds. Morgan had actively, consciously stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from her severely handicapped, entirely defenseless cousin to buy a luxury sports car and a massive, self-indulgent party. She had looked at the sacred money her mother had lovingly set aside for a disabled child and cynically decided her own superficial vanity was significantly more important. The sheer, unfathomable evil of her actions completely shattered whatever tiny remaining fragments of paternal love I still harbored deep inside my soul. I stood up from the heavy leather chair, my hands clenching into tight, white-knuckled fists at my sides. The room felt incredibly small, the air thick and stifling. She stole from Tommy, I whispered the words tasting like poison on my tongue. She robbed a disabled child so she could drink expensive champagne and drive a fast car. Warren nodded slowly, his expression mirroring my profound disgust. This is a severe federal crime, Victor. Wire fraud, grand larceny, and the deliberate financial exploitation of a vulnerable individual. If we hand this specific blue folder over to the district attorney today, Morgan will undoubtedly face a minimum of 10 years in federal prison. I turned toward the massive glass window, staring blankly at the gray clouds gathering over the tall city buildings. The daughter I had raised was dead to me now. There was absolutely no chance of redemption, no hope for a tearful reconciliation. She had crossed an unforgivable moral boundary. I turned back to face the attorney, my voice completely devoid of any remaining warmth or hesitation. Do not contact the authorities just yet, Warren. I firmly want them to walk directly into my beautifully staged corporate trap tomorrow morning, while they are still acting completely arrogant and absolutely blind. Then, we will absolutely destroy them both without showing any mercy at all, forever starting tomorrow. Friday morning unfolded with an eerie stillness across the property, the kind of heavy quiet that always precedes a devastating storm. I was sitting in my leather armchair in the main living room, sipping a hot cup of Earl Grey tea, mentally reviewing the final trap Warren and I had meticulously constructed. We had originally agreed to meet at his downtown legal office at precisely 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I was fully prepared to watch them walk into the sterile corporate boardroom, surrounded by aggressive litigation associates, and face their absolute ruin. But desperate people rarely follow a predetermined script. They are driven by an agonizing primal panic that forces them to make reckless, unpredictable maneuvers. At exactly 10:15 in the morning, the harsh crunch of gravel under heavy tires echoed through the front windows. It was significantly earlier than our agreed-upon timeline, and they were entirely in the wrong location. I stood up slowly and walked toward the large bay window. Trent's white Porsche was idling aggressively in the center of my driveway. Behind it sat a battered black sedan I did not recognize. Morgan stepped out of the passenger side of the sports car, wearing a sharp professional blazer and holding a thick leather folio. Trent emerged from the driver's side, his posture rigid and tense. From the black sedan emerged a remarkably large, burly man wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit. He carried a heavy stamped briefcase and looked entirely out of place in my quiet, affluent suburban neighborhood. He did not look like a licensed legal professional. He looked exactly like a hired enforcer. They marched up the front steps with synchronized, aggressive determination. I did not wait for them to knock. I pulled open the heavy oak door and stood squarely in the threshold, projecting an image of mild confusion to mask my total, calculated awareness. Morgan forced a brilliant, entirely artificial smile onto her face, instantly attempting to disarm me with her weaponized sweetness. "Good morning, Dad," she chirped, stepping forward to offer a hollow, entirely performative embrace. "I know we were supposed to meet downtown later this afternoon, but Trent and I realized how much of an unnecessary hassle the city traffic would be for you today. We absolutely did not want you to stress about driving all the way into the financial district, so we decided to bring the entire process directly to you in the comfort of your own home." Trent stepped up directly beside her, placing a heavy hand on her lower back. He offered me a tight, incredibly forced smile. "It just made perfect logical sense, Victor. We brought along Marcus. He is a fully certified notary public. We can easily execute the signatures right here, right now, over a fresh cup of coffee and save everyone a tremendous amount of valuable time." The burly man in the cheap suit gave a stiff, uncomfortable nod, firmly clutching his stamped briefcase. He was clearly the muscle brought along to intimidate a supposedly frail, agreeable old man into rapidly signing away a $3 million coastal estate. The absolute audacity of their maneuver was genuinely staggering. They were terrified that if I actually went into a legitimate legal office, a real attorney might review the paperwork and instantly warn me against the transfer. They needed to isolate me in my own living room completely, sever me from any professional counsel, and physically pressure me into surrendering the massive asset before the dangerous offshore syndicate deadline expired. I stepped back, opening the door wider to allow them entry. "How incredibly thoughtful of you both," I replied, keeping my voice entirely devoid of any sharp edges. "Please come into the living room and make yourselves completely comfortable." They eagerly rushed past me, marching directly into the center of the room. Morgan immediately opened her leather folio and pulled out the crisp, heavy stock pages of the decoy deed Warren had masterfully drafted. She spread the documents out across the smooth surface of my glass coffee table, carefully aligning the signature pages. The burly man named Marcus unlatched his briefcase and aggressively slapped a heavy metal notary stamp directly onto the table, placing an expensive black pen right beside it. I slowly walked over to my favorite leather armchair and deliberately sat down, crossing my right leg over my left. I picked up my porcelain teacup from the side table and took a slow, methodical sip. I did not look at the documents. I did not reach for the pen. I simply sat there, radiating a perfectly calm, impenetrable silence. Morgan looked at me with a sudden flash of profound confusion. "Well, Dad," she said, gesturing toward the papers with a tight, anxious laugh. "Everything is completely ready. You just need to initial the bottom of the first 3 pages and provide your full legal signature on the final page right next to the red tabs. Then Marcus will officially stamp it, and the entire burdensome property will finally be completely off your hands." I took another slow sip of my hot tea, letting the warm liquid soothe my throat. I placed the delicate porcelain cup gently back onto the saucer. "I am actually feeling rather comfortable right now, Morgan," I stated quietly. "I do not think I will be picking up that pen today." The atmosphere in the living room instantly shattered. The fragile, polite facade they had desperately tried to maintain evaporated in a matter of seconds. Trent's posture immediately shifted from artificially friendly to openly hostile. He took a heavy, aggressive step toward my armchair, completely dropping the role of the respectful, successful son-in-law. His face contorted into a dark, incredibly ugly scowl. "Victor, stop playing these stupid, pathetic games," Trent snapped, his voice vibrating with barely contained violent panic. "We went through all of this explicitly on Tuesday night. You fundamentally agreed to this transfer. We brought the official notary directly to your house to make this incredibly easy for you. Pick up the damn pen and sign the legal document right now." I looked up at him, meeting his aggressive, predatory stare with absolute freezing indifference. "You seem incredibly rushed, Trent. Real estate transactions require patience and careful deliberation. I would deeply prefer to wait until I can have my personal attorney review every single clause in a proper, secure environment." "There is absolutely no time for that," Trent yelled, his hands balling into tight fists at his sides. He leaned forward, looming over my armchair, attempting to use his physical size to deeply intimidate me. "The paperwork is completely flawless. Morgan and I thoroughly reviewed every single line. You are doing this for the good of the family, Victor. Do you understand me? You are securing her entire future. Stop being a stubborn, selfish old man and sign the deed immediately before you ruin absolutely everything." I calmly rested my hands on the leather armrests. "Ruin what exactly, Trent?" I asked, my tone dangerously quiet. "What specific urgent catastrophe will occur if I refuse to sign away the very home I spent decades building? Are your revolutionary technology startup investors somehow demanding the deed to a coastal property to secure your visionary corporate funding?" Trent flinched visibly, his eyes darting frantically toward Morgan. He was bleeding profound desperation, his entire body trembling with the weight of the massive unpayable syndicate debt he was secretly hiding. Morgan immediately stepped in, attempting to rescue her failing husband. She dropped to her knees right next to my chair, placing her hands aggressively over mine. "Dad, please," she begged, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch. "You promised me. You promised you would help us. We absolutely need this property right now. If you do not sign this document today, we will lose a massive once-in-a-lifetime business opportunity. You have plenty of money securely locked away. You do not even use the vineyard house anymore. Why are you being so incredibly difficult and malicious?" I looked down at the woman kneeling beside me. I saw the daughter who had joyfully excluded me from her wedding. I saw the woman who had proudly driven a luxury sports car purchased with stolen medical funds. I saw the pure, unadulterated greed radiating from every single pore of her body. She was actively trying to execute my total financial demise, and she was crying because I was refusing to hand her the loaded weapon. "Morgan," I said carefully, sliding my hands out from underneath hers. "I am not being malicious. I am simply exercising basic financial prudence. I will not sign any binding legal document without the explicit presence and explicit approval of my retained legal counsel." Trent completely lost his mind. He violently kicked the heavy glass coffee table, sending the decorative coasters crashing onto the hardwood floor. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at my face. "You arrogant, miserable old fool! You are done." I remained perfectly still in my leather armchair, completely unbothered by Trent's sudden, explosive outburst. The heavy glass coasters rattled against the hardwood floor, where he had violently kicked the coffee table, but I did not even blink. Trent stood over me, his chest heaving, his face flushed with a dangerous, unpredictable rage. The carefully constructed mask of the polished, successful financial executive had completely shattered, revealing the desperate, cornered animal hiding underneath. The large, burly man in the cheap suit, whom they had introduced as Marcus, the notary, slowly reached inside his tailored jacket, adjusting his stance to block the main exit of my living room. This was an active, physically hostile ambush inside my own home, exactly as Warren and I had anticipated when they failed to show up at the secure downtown legal office. Morgan scrambled to her feet, stepping back from my chair with a look of genuine panic. She looked at Trent, her eyes wide, silently begging him to regain control of the situation before the $3 million prize slipped away permanently. Trent took another aggressive step forward, leaning his heavy frame directly into my personal space. "You are going to pick up that pen right now, Victor," he snarled, his voice dropping into a low, menacing register. "We are completely out of time, and we are completely out of patience. You do not have a choice anymore. You are going to sign the property transfer deed today, and we are going to walk out of this house with exactly what we came for." I slowly leaned forward, reaching down beside the armrest of my chair. I picked up the thick, heavy manila folder I had discreetly placed there earlier this morning. I placed it squarely on top of the glass coffee table, right next to their completely worthless, unfiled decoy deed. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of fear. I simply looked Trent directly in the eyes. "I know exactly why you are completely out of time, Trent," I stated quietly, my voice slicing through the heavy tension in the room like a razor blade. "I know that you were unceremoniously fired from your prestigious hedge fund 4 months ago for massive corporate embezzlement. And I know precisely why you stole those corporate funds." Trent froze, the aggressive posture suddenly draining from his body, as if he had been physically struck. His jaw went completely slack. I opened the manila folder and pulled out the thick stack of forensic accounting ledgers Warren had prepared. I casually tossed them onto the glass table, letting the pages spread out over the fake property deed. "You owe exactly $1.5 million to an underground, highly dangerous offshore sports gambling syndicate." I continued, enunciating every single syllable with cold, deliberate precision. "You are a degenerate gambler who burned through his own lucrative career, and now the sharks have given you a non-negotiable deadline. I also know that you have already pre-approved a massive $2 million home equity line of credit against my Martha's Vineyard estate. Your brilliant plan was to forcefully secure my signature today, immediately trigger the cash loan wire, the funds offshore to save your own pathetic life, and flee the country with the remaining $500,000. You fully intended to let a private, aggressive bank completely foreclose on my property, leaving me entirely destitute and effectively homeless in my final years. The silence that descended upon my living room was absolutely suffocating. Trent stumbled backward, his face turning an ashen, sickly shade of gray. His eyes darted frantically around the room, frantically searching for an impossible escape from the catastrophic reality of his complete exposure. He looked like a man who had just been dragged completely naked into the freezing sunlight. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny the accusations, but the words completely failed him. The pristine, undeniable documentation of his entire ruined life was sitting directly on my coffee table, staring back at him. Morgan let out a sharp, trembling gasp. She looked at the papers, then looked at Trent, and then finally looked at me. "Dad," she stammered, her voice shaking with desperate, transparent manipulation. "Dad, you have to understand. We were in terrible, unimaginable trouble. The people Trent owes money to are incredibly dangerous. They made horrific threats against us. We had absolutely no other choice. We were going to pay you back eventually. You have to believe me. We were just trying to survive this awful situation." I turned my gaze slowly toward my daughter. The sheer, unfathomable audacity of her victimhood was genuinely breathtaking. I reached back into the manila folder and pulled out the thinner, vibrant blue file. I held it in my hands for a brief moment, feeling the heavy, sickening weight of the ultimate betrayal it contained. "I do not care about Trent or his pathetic gambling debts, Morgan," I said, my voice completely dead and devoid of any paternal affection. "He is a worthless parasite. But you are my flesh and blood. You are the woman Diane and I raised with every single ounce of love and protection we possessed." I tossed the blue folder onto the table. It landed with a sharp smack against the glass. I watched Morgan's eyes track the movement, a sudden new layer of genuine terror flashing across her face as she recognized the specific bank logo printed on the top page. "You stood in my kitchen last week and demanded my life savings because you claimed you were deeply hurt, that I missed your lavish $150,000 country club wedding," I continued, my voice rising slightly, filling the room with icy, unstoppable authority. "You drove up my driveway in a brand new $120,000 luxury sports car. I spent an entire week agonizing over how an unemployed, disgraced man could possibly afford those incredible luxuries. But Trent did not pay for the wedding or the car, did he, Morgan?" She began to shake her head frantically, taking slow, stumbling steps backward. "Dad, please do not do this," she pleaded, her hands trembling wildly in the air. "Please, you do not understand. You actively forged my legal signature." I stated the words, striking her like physical blows. "You submitted fraudulent authorization forms to a private wealth management bank. You bypassed the security protocols and directly accessed the private medical trust fund that your mother specifically established for your disabled cousin Tommy. You stole nearly $300,000 from a severely handicapped, entirely defenseless child to buy a fancy dress, a massive party, and a fast car. You literally robbed a crippled boy who requires round-the-clock, highly specialized care just to maintain your pathetic, superficial illusion of massive wealth." The mask of the terrified, desperate victim completely evaporated from Morgan's face. The heavy guilt and performative shame instantly vanished, entirely replaced by a horrifying, purely hysterical sense of absolute toxic entitlement. She completely snapped. Her face turned bright red, and she lunged forward, slamming her hands violently down onto the glass coffee table, scattering the forensic documents everywhere. "I am your actual daughter," Morgan screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing shrilly off the living room walls. The sheer volume and intensity of her outburst was entirely unhinged. That money was essentially supposed to be mine anyway. Mom gave hundreds of thousands of dollars to Tommy. But what about me? What about my life? I deserved a beautiful wedding. I deserved to live like a successful person. You are sitting on millions of dollars that you do not even use. You are just a stubborn, dying old man hoarding wealth while we are actively drowning in miserable debt. You have to save us. It is your fundamental obligation as a father to protect me. I am entitled to that property, and you are going to give it to me right now." She stood there breathing heavily, her chest heaving with unadulterated toxic entitlement. She felt absolutely zero remorse for stealing from a disabled child. She felt absolutely zero guilt for attempting to render her own father completely homeless. She only felt a massive raging fury that she had been caught before she could successfully execute the final devastating phase of her robbery. I stared at her feeling absolutely nothing but pure clinical disgust. The total destruction of our family bond was finally irrevocably complete. Trent suddenly let out a low, dark chuckle. It was a cold, humorless sound that completely lacked any remaining pretense of civility. He slowly unbuttoned his tailored navy blazer and let it hang open, revealing a tense, aggressively squared posture. He looked at Morgan, then turned his gaze back to me. The polished corporate facade was completely gone, utterly replaced by the desperate, violent reality of a cornered criminal facing total annihilation. "Well," Victor Trent snarled, a vicious, threatening sneer twisting his features. "I guess we are completely done playing the nice, happy family. It is a real shame you had to go digging into things you should have just left entirely alone. You think you are incredibly smart sitting there in your comfortable chair with your fancy financial documents. But you completely miscalculated your actual physical leverage in this specific room." Trent raised his right hand and gave a sharp, deliberate nod toward the large, burly man standing perfectly still by the front entryway. The man named Marcus immediately stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding loudly against the hardwood floor. He reached into the interior pocket of his cheap suit jacket and slowly pulled out a thick, heavy, incredibly dangerous-looking firearm. He held it casually by his side, making his lethal intentions absolutely clear without uttering a single word. He was not a notary public. He was an armed, violent enforcer sent by the offshore gambling syndicate to ensure Trent delivered the necessary funds today by any means necessary. Trent leaned all the way across the shattered coffee table, resting his knuckles directly on the forged property deed. His eyes were wide, completely wild, and filled with dark, violent desperation. "You are going to pick up that pen and properly sign this deed today, old man," Trent whispered, his voice vibrating with absolute lethal malice. "You are going to sign the document, and you are going to smile while you do it. Because if you refuse to sign away the Martha's Vineyard house right now, these guys are not just going to aggressively take your coastal property. They are going to permanently take you. You are completely alone in this house. There is absolutely no one coming to save you. Pick up the pen, Victor, or we will physically force you to sign it in your own blood." I did not flinch. I simply looked up at Trent. Then I let out a slow, genuine smile. It was not a smile of surrender. It was a smile of absolute, chilling victory. Trent blinked, visibly unnerved by my complete lack of fear. He had anticipated a terrified, crumbling old man begging for mercy. He had fully expected me to reach for the black pen and frantically sign away my entire life to save my own skin. Instead, I reached my right hand deep into my pocket. My fingers smoothly wrapped around a small, heavy remote. I pressed the button. A loud, sharp buzzer echoed down the main hallway of my home. Instantly, the heavy double doors leading from my formal home office burst wide open with a violent, resounding crash. Trent spun around, his jaw dropping in pure terror. Morgan shrieked and scrambled backward against the leather sofa. Out of the office stepped Warren Pierce, looking impeccably calm in his navy blue suit. He was flanked immediately by two incredibly large, heavily armed men wearing dark tactical vests with the words "Financial Fraud Task Force" printed in bold white letters across their chests. The trap had been completely sprung. The burly enforcer named Marcus barely had a fraction of a second to react. Before he could even attempt to raise the heavy firearm he held at his side, the two federal detectives swarmed into the living room with terrifying speed. "Drop the weapon right now!" the lead detective roared, his voice shaking the glass panes of the bay window. Marcus hesitated for just a moment, glancing at Trent for a signal, but the detectives did not give him a chance to decide. One of the officers forcefully tackled Marcus around his thick waist, driving his heavy shoulder directly forward. They crashed violently onto the hardwood floor, knocking over a heavy floor lamp. The firearm skittered uselessly across the smooth wood, coming to rest harmlessly against the baseboard. The second detective instantly dropped his knee directly into the middle of his back, pinning the enforcer firmly to the ground, while swiftly securing his wrists in heavy steel handcuffs. "You are under arrest for armed extortion and conspiracy to commit wire fraud." The detective stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. Trent stood completely frozen in the center of the living room, his arms raised slightly in the air. He trembled. His entire body shook like a dry leaf in a winter storm. He looked at the restrained enforcer on the floor, then looked at the armed detectives, and finally his panicked gaze landed on Warren. Morgan was pressed flat against the wall, her hands clamped tightly over her mouth, completely incapable of formulating a coherent sentence. She watched in absolute horror as the illusion of her brilliant, flawless robbery evaporated into thin air. I remained perfectly seated in my leather armchair, carefully smoothing the fabric of my trousers. I gestured calmly toward the opened office doors and smiled at Warren. "Please come in, Warren," I stated peacefully. "We were just discussing some incredibly pressing real estate transactions." Warren walked slowly into the center of the living room, smoothly sidestepping the scattered forensic documents and the broken glass coasters. He stopped right beside my armchair, holding a pristine, heavy stock envelope. He looked at Trent with a gaze of pure, clinical disdain. "I believe your unfiled, completely worthless decoy deed is no longer required, Mr. Hayes," Warren said smoothly. "You see, Victor and I had a very productive meeting at my downtown office earlier this week. We finalized the true destiny. We finalized the destiny of the massive coastal estate quite some time ago." I held out my hand, and Warren respectfully placed the heavy envelope into my palm. I pulled out a thick, beautifully bound legal document. It bore genuine, deeply embossed official state registry seals and a series of vibrant red, verified notary stamps. It was the authentic, fully executed property transfer deed. I tossed it onto the coffee table, letting it land squarely on top of the offshore gambling ledgers. "You wanted the $3 million coastal property, Morgan," I said, my voice cutting through the silent room. "You wanted to brutally extract my life savings to pay off a violent sports gambling syndicate, and you fully intended to leave me completely destitute, to rot in an aggressive foreclosure. But you vastly underestimated my intelligence, and you profoundly underestimated my deep capacity for retaliation. I knew you were going to attempt this disgusting home equity loan scheme. I knew exactly how desperate your pathetic husband was." Trent stared down at the official deed, his eyes scanning the dense legal language printed on the top page. His face contorted in a mixture of absolute confusion and extreme despair. "What is this?" he choked out, his voice barely a weak, pathetic whisper. "What did you do?" "I did exactly what a responsible father does when he realizes his wealth is actively attracting dangerous predators," I replied, staring directly into his terrified eyes. "Exactly 48 hours ago, I legally and irrevocably transferred the total unencumbered ownership of the coastal property estate out of my personal portfolio. I gifted the entire $3 million property to a fully protected, legally impenetrable entity." Morgan slowly lowered her hands from her face, her eyes wide with greedy, frantic disbelief. "You gave it away?" she asked, her voice cracking with sheer hysteria. "You just gave away our house." "It was never your house, Morgan," I corrected her sharply. "It was my house, the home I built with your mother, and now it officially belongs to the Harbor Youth Foundation." Warren stepped forward, adjusting his suit jacket, relishing the moment of absolute legal destruction. The Harbor Youth Foundation is a widely respected charity that operates a massive network of dedicated orphanages and comprehensive community centers for severely disadvantaged children across the entire state. Warren explained, his tone ringing with triumphant authority. Victor placed the coastal estate into an ironclad, permanent, irrevocable trust, specifically designated exclusively for their charitable use. The legal transfer was officially filed, thoroughly verified, and fully executed 2 days ago. The property is permanently locked away forever. You cannot reverse it. You cannot borrow against it. You cannot legally touch a single solitary penny of that equity. You have absolutely nothing. Morgan let out a piercing, agonizing scream, that echoed through the entire house. She fell to her knees, clutching her head in her hands violently rocking back and forth. "No," she wailed, sobbing with pure, unadulterated entitlement. "You cannot do this. You have to undo it right now. We need that money to survive. They are going to kill him. You have to save us." She was completely melting down, entirely consumed by the realization that her brilliant, flawless plot had resulted in her total, unmitigated destruction. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely zero pity. "You actively stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from a severely handicapped, entirely defenseless child to fund your pathetic vanity, Morgan. You robbed that medical trust to buy a luxury sports car and a massive wedding reception. You plotted to render your own father completely homeless to save a degenerate gambler. You deserve absolutely everything that is about to happen to you." Trent suddenly dropped to his knees, burying his face in his hands, openly weeping like a terrified child. He was completely defeated. His corporate career was permanently destroyed. His massive embezzlement was thoroughly documented. His illegal offshore gambling debts were totally exposed, and the violent syndicate he owed $1.5 million to was going to demand immediate payment. The very foundation of his life was reduced to a pile of burning ash. The lead federal detective stepped forward, hauling the handcuffed enforcer to his feet. He looked directly at Trent. "Mr. Hayes, you are formally detained for your active participation in an armed extortion plot, grand larceny, and massive corporate embezzlement. Your wife is also facing immediate federal wire fraud charges regarding the illegal transfer of restricted medical trust funds. My task force has already secured your domestic bank accounts and confiscated the luxury vehicle sitting in the driveway." Morgan looked up, her tear-streaked face twisted in an ugly mask of pure hatred and furious despair. "You ruined my life," she screamed at me, her voice breaking into a hoarse, jagged sob. "I hate you. I will always hate you for this." I stood up from my leather armchair, slowly buttoning my suit jacket. I looked at the daughter I had once loved more than life itself, completely recognizing that the greedy, parasitic woman kneeling on my floor was an absolute stranger. "You ruined your own life, Morgan. You built your entire world on a foundation of cruel, arrogant lies. I simply provided the necessary inspection, and the rotten structure collapsed exactly as it was meant to. The trap had flawlessly worked, and my absolute victory was finally beautifully complete." The lead detective stepped forward, the metallic click of handcuffs echoing through the quiet, opulent room like a gunshot. He read Morgan her rights, his voice a steady, emotionless monotone that contrasted sharply with the chaotic scene. She stood there, her face devoid of any color, looking down at the cold, clinical steel cuffs that now bound her wrists together. Behind her, Trent had completely collapsed. The arrogance, the desperate threats, and the carefully curated facade of a corporate titan had vanished, replaced by the shivering, whimpering shell of a man who suddenly understood that his very life was hanging by a fraying thread. I did not look at the enforcer being dragged away, nor did I look at the officers moving toward Trent to secure him. I walked slowly over to the coffee table and picked up my small packed leather travel bag. I paused directly in front of Trent. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and unfocused, pleading for a shred of intervention. I leaned down my face inches from his and lowered my voice to a whisper that was meant only for him. I told him that I had just spent 10 minutes on an encrypted line with his offshore gambling syndicate. I told them that the Martha's Vineyard house was now permanently locked in an irrevocable charity trust, and that I had provided them with his current, completely bankrupted financial profile. They now knew he had absolutely zero collateral and no way to ever pay back his $1.5 million debt. The color drained from Trent's face so completely, he looked like a wax statue. He knew exactly what that meant. The people he had defrauded did not care about the legal system or arrest warrants. They only cared about their missing money. Trent opened his mouth to scream, but the detectives were already on him, pinning his arms behind his back and forcing him to his feet. Morgan turned her head, catching my gaze as the officers began to guide her toward the front door. The hysterical, entitled anger that had consumed her minutes earlier had been replaced by a pathetic, performative display of childhood desperation. "Dad, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking as she stumbled against the detective's firm grip. "I am your little girl. You cannot let them do this to me. You are my father. You are supposed to protect me no matter what. I am your daughter, Dad. Please tell them there has been some kind of terrible mistake." I watched her tears streak through her expensive makeup, and for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no resentment, no lingering paternal warmth. There was only the cold, clear realization that the person in front of me was a hollow creation of my own misguided indulgence. I did not break my stride. I stepped past her, my shoulders squared and my breathing steady. I paused for a single second by the heavy oak door, looking back one last time at the wreckage of the life they had tried to steal. "You did not invite me to your wedding," I said, my voice cutting through the room with the finality of a closing tomb. "Don't expect me to attend your funeral." I pushed the door open and stepped out into the crisp, biting afternoon air. The sunlight felt different on my face. It was no longer the oppressive, suffocating heat of the construction site. It was the cool, refreshing clarity of a new beginning. I did not look back as the police cruisers pulled out of my driveway, their lights flashing in the afternoon fog. I walked to my truck, climbed inside, and started the engine. The weight I had carried for years, the burden of a legacy built on the shifting sands of manipulation, was gone. I drove toward the outskirts of the city, leaving the financial district and the crumbling ruins of my previous life far behind me. The Harbor Youth Foundation was located in a quiet, sun-drenched neighborhood. It was a place Diane had always wanted to support, a refuge for children who had never known the stability I had once taken for granted. As I turned into the main gates, I saw the expansive grounds. A group of children were playing soccer on the central field, their laughter rising in the air like music. A young woman, the director of the foundation, saw my truck pull up and walked toward me with a welcoming smile. She had been the one to help me finalize the trust documents, and she was the only one who truly understood the weight of the gift. I stepped out of the truck and walked across the grass. A young boy no older than 7 stopped his game and ran over, staring at me with a mixture of curiosity and unbridled joy. I knelt down, the ache in my knees finally silenced by a deep, resonant peace. He held out his hand, and I took it, feeling the warmth of a life that was just beginning, a life that was no longer threatened by the greed of my own blood. I looked at the orphanage, the solid brick walls, the secure playgrounds, and the hopeful faces of the children whose futures were now shielded by the estate. The money had not been wasted. It had been transformed from a source of corruption into a source of salvation. I was not alone. In that moment, surrounded by the genuine, untainted laughter of the children, I realized I had found a new true family. I had traded the parasitic hollow bonds of my past for something permanent and profound. I stood up, walked into the main hall of the center, and knew that for the first time in my entire life, I was finally, completely, and utterly home.